Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined once again by Shimon Szimonowitz, who is the Rav of Pine River Village, Nusach Svard, and Rosh Machon Alei Zayis, and we'll be discussing a new sefer published by Machon Alei Zayis, Tefillah B'Tzibur, with two parts: Oil Shalom, which is Berurim in the Sukkos going through Simonim of the whole Indian of Tefillah B'Tzibur, and She'ela Shalom, 600 plus Shailas asked to various Rabbanim about the Indian of Hilchas Tefillah B'Tzibur, and it was written by Reb Shalom Tzvi Grunfeld and published by Alei Zayis. So thank you, Reb Shimon, for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me. I have to tell you that I get unbelievable regards every time I'm on your podcast. I was recently by a conference. I met people from all over the world. I met somebody from Hong Kong. I met people from all over the United States. And my identity was that they heard me on the Nachi's podcast. So you are very widely heard, and it's an honor to be here once more.
So it's not just the Rav and the Rosh Machon. We have to say podcast guests, frequent podcast guests, and people hear about it. Okay. So this sefer all about one topic. It seems like I'll start with a digression for a second that you're publishing many Sfarim at the Machon. It seems like today, I don't know about this, in the Sfarim store, but maybe from the Machon end, that there's a lot of Sfarim now coming out on specific mitzvahs or specific halachic topics, just one whole sefer dedicated to it. We don't have to go into that so much. I think it's interesting to mention. I don't have anything to add on that. So this sefer is specifically all on Hilchas Tefillah B'Tzibur.
Actually, I think it is a trend that has been started a while back already. I mean, Shmir Shabbos Kolchos is obviously more encompassing. It has all of Hilchos Shabbos. But the concept of specializing on the topic is definitely the trend going in the direction. Every mitzvah has its Kehilchasa, and it's being discussed at length. And it's actually a good trend because anyone who wants to focus on a specific topic, someone does the work for him of collecting all the information and all the sources and bringing and opening up conversations that pertain to that particular mitzvah. So if anyone wants to know anything about Tefillah B'Tzibur, this would definitely be a very important resource for him.
Right, similar to how we did Sefer Bris last time, which was all Bris Milah. That's a little different, but similar happening. Okay, so let's jump into the Sefer, Tefillah B'Tzibur. What can you tell the listeners about the Sefer?
So it's a very interesting Sefer. Its structure itself is already interesting, as indicated on the cover and in the Sharblat. It has two parts. The Oil Shalom is Birurei Halacha. Those are essays, each one not very long essays, short, easy essays that start with usually a question. For example, in the first shar, which explores the actual underlying chiyuv of Tefillah B'Tzibur, and I think we should talk about that, whether it's a real chiyuv, an absolute chiyuv, is it just something that's preferred to do? There will be different opinions, and each essay will discuss the source of the obligation, whether it's a real obligation, the opinion of Rav Moshe, the opinion of the Rishonim. It will go through that. Then a very fascinating shar that is called the Shar HaMishkal. The Shar HaMishkal, this is all in the first part of essays, we'll talk about, and this is basically daily dilemmas that people face all the time, whether should they do Tefillah B'Tzibur or something else which gets in their way. So, for example, you have a choice of helping with the children at home, but you're going to miss Tefillah B'Tzibur. Which one should you do? Or if a person has a choice of Tefillas Ezra versus Tefillah B'Tzibur, it's one or the other. Or, for example, he can only make it a Tefillah B'Tzibur, and then he'll miss his Shir or a Seder or anything like that. And there are literally hundreds of situations that he will discuss, and it will be more as an essay, a discussion. This one says that, but then we can prove this, but is there a proof that way and this way? And as the Sefer, interestingly enough, as the Sefer was developing, constantly the author was being approached with people who knew that he's working on the Sefer and saying, I just had this situation today. What do you say about this? What should I do in this situation? And then we have to stop what we're doing and add another chapter to the Sefer. I myself, I'm guilty of this. There's a shaila that actually came up about a year ago. It was my son's bar mitzvah, and my older son, who was ready by mitzvah, he was under the impression that we're going to have a minyan ma'ariv, or mincha actually, it was a minyan mincha at the bar mitzvah. So he made sure not to daven mincha the whole entire day so that he could be part of the minyan at the bar mitzvah. In the meantime, it wasn't our final plans. Our final plans was that everyone will daven mincha before, and the bar mitzvah will start, and there will be no mincha by the bar mitzvah. So now he comes home, he's after yeshiva, and he had not daven mincha yet, and we're right about to go to pictures. He says, 1 second, I need daven mincha. So he's going to either miss pictures and go to mincha, or he's going to have to daven mincha b'yachid and then he's going to miss the pictures. Now, his mother will not be very happy that there's one person missing from the pictures. So here's a real dilemma. How great is the Chiyuv Tefillah B'tzibur? Do you say, I am obligated to daven Tefillah B'tzibur, and therefore I will have to miss the pictures, and there will be no family pictures of the entire family for this bar mitzvah? Or do we say no? We say the family pictures, pleasing your mother or preserving the moment, is more important, or at least it's enough important that we can cast aside tefillah b'tzibur, and he can participate in the pictures and daven tefillah b'yechidus. So I thought this is a great question. I asked him, do you talk about a shai like that? That's it. We had to stop the presses. And again, add another, I'm exaggerating a little bit, we had to add another chapter to the Sefer, and he actually wrote, it wasn't the author himself, but he asked a friend of his, Reb Tzvi Kaplan, that he should write that simon, and we have an essay about this question, whether someone has a choice of either making pictures, family pictures, or tefillah b'tzibur, which one comes first?
And don't leave us in suspense. What happened?
What happened was a friend was nice enough that right after pictures, he picked my son up from the hall, took him to the shul, he davened b'tzibur, and he took him back to the hall because try to explain to a teenager that it's more important to take pictures and please your mother than to miss tefillah b'tzibur. It doesn't really work, so it's not practical, but it's a theoretical question that people would like to find out, and there is countless questions. There's another question that I asked that's also was a catalyst to writing another essay, but it's too embarrassing to mention. But you'll go through the Simonim, you might figure it out maybe which one it was.
Okay, so like you said, there's many different interesting topics, and also that's before we even get to the queries that the Mechaber asked the different Rabbanim. But in the beginning, you mentioned the first simon is about the Chiyuv or not. I think that's a good place to start to just in brief. We're not going to go through the whole sugya, but just briefly, is Tefillah B'tzibur a Chiyuv or not?
So I think most people are under the impression, and that is definitely probably the right impression, that it's an absolute Chiyuv. That's a mitzvah, deraisa, drabanon, probably drabanon, to daven Tefillah B'tzibur. That's something that everyone knows. But when people get a little older, especially those of us who learned in yeshivas, and certainly those that learned in brisk-oriented yeshivas, know that there's this concept that if you're very, very, very frum or very, very brisker, maybe you don't have to daven tefillah b'tzibur. And it remains an anomaly why that is so, that you can have a person that is of a great Talmud Chacham and he will miss tefillah b'tzibur. It's not clear why. I always wondered about it. We know the Brisker Rov was medaktik b'kalika b'chamura, so it's a bit of a mystery why it is a fact that he certainly didn't always daven tefillah b'tzibur. But I always used to assume that the reason was because there's actually a Dina de Gemara and there's halacha in the Shulchan Aruch which says that someone who is teirasai umnasai is really potter from tefillah b'tzibur. So perhaps even though the poskim say that don't try this at home, and don't mind the pun, and you should not consider yourself teirasei umnasai even if you truly learn all the time. And also, it's not supposed to be done constantly. Perhaps the Brisker Rov went with Ikra Din for other reasons, and that's why he did it. But recently, I noticed something interesting in the book Memoirs of a Grandmother that some of your listeners might be familiar with. So the author is the daughter of the Minchas Yehuda, who was a Volozhina Talmud, and the Talmud, I believe, of Itzel Volozhina, and he was a Choshev a Sefer. Anyone's familiar with the Sefer Minchas Yehuda? It's Choshev a Sefer. Abudel Epstein, and his daughter writes in her memoirs about her father's habits and how he spent his day. So Shachris, he writes, he went to shul, but for Mincha, she writes that I actually borrowed it from your library and I marked it off.
This is the memoirs of Pauline Wengeroff.
Right. So I asked you to give it to me before we started. Why am I not seeing it right now? So he writes, he usually said Mincha Gedoyla at home very early. So he davened Mincha G'dayla at home. There probably was no minion Mincha G'dayla in town, but interesting, she writes that he davened Mincha G'dayla at home. So it could be a lot of things you find out. A lot of things the Brisker Rov did were not unique to the Brisker Rov. It might have been the ways of Rabbanim in Lita. But whatever the case of the Brisker Rov is, so this is where everyone knows this concept that the Brisker Rov said. It's not an absolute chiyuv. It's tzarich. You should be mishtadel. Now, whether he said that or not, we don't know, but that's a very big part of the Sefer discussing whether or not is an absolute chiyuv or not an absolute chiyuv. And something very unique about the Sefer, and I have to credit the author of the Sefer. Most of the time when someone takes a topic, he gets so into his topic that he's always being very overly machmer, and wherever he goes, he sees his obligation, his mitzvah, and he forces it in every situation without any Mishkal HaChasidus. And this author is actually the opposite. He's not trying to impose Tefillah B'tzibur in every situation. He says the other rabbis sometimes you have a situation where for Shalom Bayis, for other reasons, it would better not to daven Tefillah B'tzibur, and it would be a wrong Chasidus to go and daven Tefillah B'tzibur. Although he himself is personally very, very careful with Tefillah B'tzibur, and he actually has a very interesting story, which was not the impetus for writing the Sefer, but it came up in the middle of the Sefer, and on page Chof Aleph, he says that he was makabel on himself to be mefarsem a ma'aseh that happened with his own son, whose son was in sakonas maves chas v'shalom for a few days. And during that time, while he was already working on the Sefer, he took upon himself to be meschazik and tefillah b'tzibur. And immediately after the tefillah that he took this kabbalah upon himself, he saw there was a great improvement in his son's condition to the point that it went beyond the expectations of the doctors. So he's not encouraging people, chas v'shalom, not to be careful with tefillah b'tzibur, and he actually has a few chapters in the beginning encouraging people to have tefillah b'tzibur, and he ends off with divrei chizuk about tefillah b'tzibur, but in the halacha part of it, the emes is ohov b'yoser, and he tries to stick to the halacha. The feeling is that Rav Moshe Feinstein is one of the only sources that say it's an absolute chiyuv as any other mitzvah d'Rabbanon with no less than that. But there are many, many sources that would indicate that it's not the same level chiyuv as another mitzvah midrabanon, and therefore a person should always be able to weigh it against the situation and know when is it right for him to daven tefillah b'tzibur and when is it right for him to participate in family pictures or something else like that. In the Shilas Rabbanim in the back, which is a very important and fascinating part of the Sefer, there's over 600 Shilas Rabbanim. So this Shilah, of course, was posed to all the Rabbanim that were asked. And the Rabbanim did not feel comfortable in coming out and saying that it's not an absolute chiyuv. So that's something which remains to be studied and to be mefalpel with. And the Sefer does go with discussion. It's not like this situation, this is halacha, this situation is halacha. There's a discussion. He gives you development of his thought. You see, I first thought this, and then someone brought a raya this way, and someone said a raya this way. His yeshiva also comes to life. He's part of very elite kollel. And in the kollel, they all discussed these shilas. So there was a dibuk chaverim, and you see it in the course of the sefer. I thought like this, but my friend told me this, and this one said that. And I saw in this sefer like this. It gives it a little bit interest. It's an interesting read and an easy read actually to go through each of these questions and each of these shilas.
Right, so not only is it telling you the halacha and it's informative in a lot of different situations, it's also an enjoyable read. You can pick it up, you can read it in Shul and Yom Tov and Daven, you can read it in Tefillah B'tzibur, or just read it wherever if you want to read about Tefillah B'tzibur. So, you mentioned over there that wasn't his impetus for writing the Sefer. Why did he decide to write, I'm going to write this massive Sefer, and it's a few hundred pages, it's a big book on Tefillah B'tzibur.
So what drove someone to do something? It would be best to ask him. I'm here to discuss the Sefer, not the author, but I believe it's just that he started going into the sugya and he found it fascinating. Let's once and for all decide this question. Is it an absolute chiyuv? It's not an absolute chiyuv. There's so much, we'll use a very contemporary term, there's so much hak about this shaila. So therefore, let's actually delve to the depth of it and see whether or not it's a real shaila, it's a real chiyuv, not a real chiyuv, what's together the chiyuv, which led to the next part, which I find the most interesting part of the Sefer, of the Shar HaMishkol, to see, let's now weigh each situation separately. What do I do in this situation, that situation, the other situation? There's many other aspects of the halachas of Tefillah B'tzibur. For example, what forms a tzibur, who is able to be mitzdaref l'tzibur. So he touches upon some of that. L'mashal Nashar Koil, he'll talk about if someone who's a Rasha could be mitzdaref l'tzibur. The Debretzina Rav goes so far to say that someone who has a television is not able to be mitzdaref to the tzibur. He did not want to get into the contemporary question of having smartphones, chas v'shalom, if you're able to mitzdaref to tzibur or not, according to the Debretzina Rav. The Debretzina Rav didn't live to see smartphones, so he couldn't paskin about it. But he has these discussions as well. And as you probably can imagine, from based on what I said, we don't. The conclusion is not that you can't be mistar of someone who has a television. The conclusion is also not to have a television, but that's not the conclusion in that case. So, but there isn't that much about what forms a tzibur. There isn't that much about. There is. I should say there is a significant amount of at which point and davening will join together the tzibur. But one of the big COVID questions, now I would have assumed right away, say for like this, it was an outgrowth of COVID. It actually has nothing to do with COVID. It's not a COVID sefer. There's a lot of literature that's COVID svarim. There's not a COVID sefer, but the COVID shiloh was how you mitzaref in different places, people standing not apart. That is not touched upon at all. That's a very important sugya that's not touched upon in this sefer. So it's mostly about the tefillah b'tzibur, is how much of a chiyuv it is and what to do in all those different situations.
Something that is touched upon in the Sefer, which is very important and very relevant for many listeners, is davening in a house minyan on Shabbos. It's something that comes up. Many people Friday night, they don't want to walk to the shul, they want to daven in a house, or on Motzei Shabbos. Actually, I have Uncle Zevi. My uncle, he does not like davening in a house minyan ever, even if make a simcha. Daven in a house. No, I go to shul. There's Indian davening in shul. So this is something that the Mechaber does touch upon. I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about it because, again, it's relevant for many people. Many communities have this question that often comes up.
So, yes, truth be told, there are actually some poskim who say that davening in a shul without a minyan might even be more important than davening at home, in a home, with a minyan. And a lot of the sources that are used for tefillah b'tzibur, and this is discussed in the Sefer, are actually sources that tell you to daven in a shul, not necessarily with a tzibur. So davening in a shul is certainly important. And sometimes a home could have a home that has a place where someone sits and learns. There is a status of a Medrash Shel Yachid that might have its own status, but davening in a shul is certainly an absolute chiyuv. To add a twist to your question, and just to jump a second to the end of the Sefer, where they talk about the Shailas to Rabbanim, so another Shaila is, again, a question of preference. You have a son who his father wants to daven with him in his house with his minyan for Kabbalah Shabbos, a Friday night minyan, and the boy wants to go to the shul. So what's more important? Should he daven with his father in a home, or should he go to shul without his father? And a lot of fathers prefer when their sons daven with them. It's a lot of source of tension in people's homes when the father insists the boy davens with him, and the boy says, no, I want to go daven somewhere else. So what do you do in such a situation? So the Reb Chaim Kanievsky, one of the people answer this question, say to do the will of your father is considered kibud av, and therefore it's preferable for the son to daven with his father at home, not in a shul with a minyan, rather than davening in a shul with not where his father is. And there are a lot of discussions. Just to give you an example to be able to jump to the Shilas and Chuvas. Another question of this, which also touches upon this tension of father and sons, which I think a lot of people deal with this as the boys get older. They want to declare their independence and not be their father's sidekick next to him in shul. So they find all kinds of creative reasons. Some boys because the shul davens too slow, some boys because the shul is davens too quick, some because the shul is not from enough, some boys the shul is too from. But whatever it is, the shul that their father chose is never the right shul for them. And here's a question that was asked to Reb Nevensal. What's better, to daven on Yomim Neiroyim? This is a typical question. She daven yeshiva minyan, which is much better for the kavana, and daven b'tzibur, with a big tzibur, or to daven with his father in a different minyan. Reb Nevensal says that kibud ava aim is a mitzvah gedoyla, and therefore ulai ze odif. I might get into trouble with yeshivas for being mafars in this, but yeshiva bacharim probably don't listen to podcasts anyway, so it's not so relevant to them.
I actually was told recently that they do. I mean, I haven't gotten feedback, but someone, a friend of mine told me, I won't name names, I don't know if he wants me to say, that his son, he was going through 24/6 and different podcasts that he gave him in his son's yeshiva, in a very good yeshiva in Lakewood, and he said, oh, I want Svarim Chatter. That's a podcast I like listening to. So maybe they do. So maybe Reb Shimon just got them in trouble, and they're gonna come after Machon Ali Zayis. Maybe they'll be in the Gillian soon. We'll talk about it. Does the Gillian talk about this? Whether this
was actually featured in the Gillian, and
this Shiloh,
not this Shiloh, but this different general Shiloh field, but Tzibur, and it did generate a lot of interesting conversation. I just met someone yesterday. He said he wrote in about it. It's something that actually does interest people. I find this is a very point that people have a lot of a gray area with. How much is this chiyuv and what to do in all these situations that come up all the time? Of booking a ticket. Can I book a ticket and go on take a flight? How much am I mechuyev to make sure that I'll make a minyan, or can I say I can't take into consideration? Also a shilah that's asked. Interestingly, I saw it from Moshe Sternbach's shilas. They asked him about making a minyan. He asked about making a minyan on a plane. Ha'im kedai lasis minyan b'matos. B'derech klal, Rav Sternbach says, ein roy lasos she'i efshar lispal kach bekavona v'gam mafriya la'acherim. And then he goes on. He says, "What about if they actually made a minyan on the plane, and in the middle of Shemini Esrei, the crew calls out that everyone has to sit down and put on their seatbelt? What should you do?" Sagt Rav Moshe Sternbach, the head of the Eid HaCharedis, Ein breira v'yachzil l'mekoyim v'yeshiv. If the crew announces that you should go in middle, he says in middle of Shemoneh Esrei, you should sit down in your seat and put on your seatbelt.
And again, that's a very relevant child. Many that fly, it comes up. By the way, I just want to mention, going back to Yom HaRaim, so now you have what to write about in the Gillian for Yom HaRaim. You can talk about the child. It's the type of thing. There's a lot of very interesting material here, and I would imagine that this would bring out very lively conversation and letters back into the editors of the Olim Gillian because of this type of topic. So we're discussing how the section, we've had 600 plus questions that he asked the various Rabbanim. Which other Rabbanim, we mentioned a few, which other Rabbanim besides Rav Nebenzahl and Rav Sternbach, which other Rabbanim did, were these shilas asked to, and also some other examples of what they had to say.
So there are a lot of Rabbanim were asked. I don't know if we'll be able to cover all of them. I mentioned besides Rav Moshe Sternbach, I also mentioned Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and Rav Naftali Nussbaum is one of the Rabbanim that were asked. And to give a good example of his shayla, he was asked if somebody is wearing shorts and he has to daven, so what's more important? Should you change into long pants or should you daven in your shorts? So a shayla, Adam oimid b'choif hayam, he's at the beach and he's wearing shorts and there's a minyan. Should he join the minyan in shorts? Or if he has to put on his regular clothes, miss Tefillah b'tzibur. So surprisingly, Rav Naftali Nussbaum says a person should daven with shorts, with a minyan, rather than putting on long pants.
It's different, but similar to the hat and jacket shayla. Now without a hat and jacket, you need to get your hat and jacket.
This is obviously already, we're past the hat and jacket issue at this point.
But that's one that when you always hear, this is shorts.
But in a footnote, it's brought down, Shemati b'shem Agon Rabbi Yitzchak Tovia Weiss, the guy of Yerushalayim, that he said the daven yechidus with long pants. He talking about the hat and jacket. My Rebbe, Rabbi Yankiv Landau, he was our Rebbe in Torah Tamima, he told us that a person should rather daven yechidus with a hat than to daven with a minyan without a hat. I'm just putting it out there, what he told us when we were in yeshiva.
It reminds me of I remember in camp Achim as a kid, it was always a rule in camp, you can't daven in Crocs or flip-flops, and if a kid would come in, or even if it was, you got to go back, you got to go all the way back to the bunkhouse to get your shoes, you can't daven. Like that was the rule, and so those clothing related shilas come up.
In another Rav, and some of these Rabbanim, what's interesting about these Rabbanim, and they're not all, like I mentioned before, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, a lot of Sfarim have in the back, Shailas Shuvas Reb Chaim Kanievsky, but here are some Rabbanim that you don't find all the time as Shailas Shuvas. And you have Rabbi Szimonowitz, who's a very important posik actually in South Fallsburg, and he also has a lot of interesting Shailas and very nice Shuvas. And there's also an interesting story that he brings down, that a person has a choice of davening b'tzibur on Chanukah, and then he's not going to be able to light menorah b'zman. He'll be able to be Saimach under Ramah that you could light the whole entire night nowadays, or should he daven b'yechidus and be able to light on time? And Rabbi Szimonowitz writes that his father, he used to learn in Yeshiva Shar Yosher in Borough Park with a group of Talmidei Chachamim, elderly Talmidei Chachamim, and the Seder was until 6:30 every day. And his father lived in Flatbush, and they asked Rav Moshe Feinstein what to do on Chanukah. If they'll all stop the Seder and learn and daven b'zman and daven b'tzibur and daven b'zman, they're going to go and they'll lose the chance to, the whole Seder will be disrupted. Or should you just finish the Seder and light afterwards? And Lamaisa, Rav Moshe said, take a look, a lot of Balabatim come home after work, so you know different, finish the Seder and go home after work. And he says in Beis HaTalmud, they would daven Ma'ariv at 5:40, which was 72 minutes after Shkia. Ma'ariv in Beis HaTalmud took 25 minutes. So most Yungalite who left 25 minutes after Ma'ariv began, was already a half hour after Tzeis, is when they came home. That's when they lit. I think it's also well known that Reb Aaron, the idea of Reb Aaron's man, wasn't so much a concern of trying to be Yaitza all the Shitas of Chanukah as much as it was not to disrupt the second Seder. So here again, you have a case that based on that, he said it's Pasha that Tefillah B'tzibur is more important, rather daven Tefillah B'tzibur and be Soymech on the Shita on daven of lighting Chanukah later. So that's another example of an interesting shayla. Yes, shaylas also that were asked to Rabbi Forsheimer, Shmuel Felder. There's another example, very mechudesh dig psak from Rabbi Forsheimer, which actually is also something that has to do with camp. You mentioned camp; it's coming up soon. If a person could daven tefillah b'tzibur after, but he will not be able to say Kriya Shema Zman, in other words, he'll have to say Kriya Shema before davening, or he should daven b'yechidus before Zman Kriya Shema. Which one comes first? And Rabbi Forsheimer surprisingly says, rather than b'yechidus before Zman Krishma, not Zman Tefillah, Zman Krishma, rather than davening b'tzibur b'Zman Krishma. And then he says that Rabbi Forsheimer himself, when he was in camp, there was a minyan, and I know my son has been in camp together with Forsheimer, and he says that they daven actually later than I would expect, usually the yeshiva davening, but Rabbi Forsheimer insisted that he will not partake in the minyan if they can daven after Zman Tefillah. Another very interesting shaila, which a lot of people grapple with, some people say it's a chil Hashem for a ben Torah to be seen in a shul after 8 o'clock or after 9 o'clock, or after 10 o'clock. So there's another shaila that was asked Rabbi Forsheimer, a ben Torah that for some reason had to daven late, is it a chil Hashem daven b'tzibur, or should he rather daven b'yachid? So Rabbi Forsheimer says a ben Torah which learns in yeshiva should not daven late b'tzibur. It's hard to give an exact time, but he says, but for sure, after 9 o'clock, it's better to daven at home than to daven in a shul. But it's only in the middle of Zman, but bein Zmanim, it's not a chil Hashem. And he says, even in yeshiva, when he says the yeshiva, it means bismedish gavoya, there's also minyan at 9 o'clock. But during the Zman, Rabbi Forsheimer advises to rather than b'yechidus at home than to cause a chil Hashem of seeing a ben Torah, should look like he has extra time and is able to just saunter into shul after 9 o'clock in the morning. He has Sha'al Sir Moshe Heinemann, and Moshe Heinemann actually relates an interesting psak that he himself got. He says, I just actually, it wasn't what I was going to mention, but I noticed right next to it, I mentioned before, a Beis Medrash Shel Yachid. So the shaila is, he's asked about the Ramah that I mentioned before, the Terosei Nosoi, it has a Mila, and you could daven in B'Yechidus, says, do you have to have the Mila of Beis Medrash? So Rav Moshe Heinemann says, yes, you have to Ma'al Beis Medrash, but the Ramah is talking about a Beis Medrash Shel Yachid, which is a Mokim Kavur that a person learns, which is called in our terms study. So a person has a study, we have Svarim, and he learns B'Kvius. That's also the status of Beis Medrash Shel Yachid, and that's also something which a person could daven. There's many, I can go on and on with all these interesting shilas that come up over here. But the Shmuel Kamenetsky, there's some short answers, questions and answers. Daniel Kleiman. Really,
a lot of material and many interesting. Again, there's the Simonim, which are the essays, and then there's this part. So really, everything Tefillah B'tzibur related, and really, the part that you're reading just makes for fun reading, just about a halakhic topic. Very interesting. You get a lot of different places, you get the feel and the flavor of what they were passing. So, I guess to finish off on the final question. So, who'd you say this sefer is meant for?
This sefer is meant for someone who deals with this issue, that he wants to have a reference to look up any shaila that pertains to Tefillah B'tzibur, someone who wants to study Tefillah B'tzibur, or anyone who wants to have interesting, they call in Yiddish chikav, or in Ivrit they say pikante shazachen, things that are interesting, or any Talmud Chacham who wants to go through all these sugyas. There's so many sugyas, and there's so many interesting shailas. If you can mitzvah for goy to minyan, if a guy has a chiyuv. Now, I'm not if you can for goy, of course you can't. If a guy has a chiyuv tefillah b'tzibur, Rav Moshe Feinstein actually says that even though it's not from the Shav mitzvah noich, but including the mitzvah amunah is that a guy is supposed to daven. So would you advise a guy that should attend the minyan and he should daven tefillah b'tzibur? I know the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually also encouraged the daven tefillah b'tzibur. I was once at a Farbrengen in a Lubavitcher group in Borough Park when I was a bacher, and I remember one of the shlichim got up and he said that it used to be that we were able to sleep on the plane because they had time to sleep after they offered every not from yid or any yid on the plane to put on tefillin, and they all either did or declined, so your job was done. But when the Rebbe gazed given the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neach, when the Rebbe went and he encouraged that people should also approach the non-Jews and suggest that they keep the Sheva Mitzvah B'nei Noach, so now we have to go to every non-Jew on the plane and said, have you prayed today? So it seems like the Rebbe also held like Rav Moshe Feinstein that davening for a non-Jew is also part of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. So here he discusses, does he have to daven tefillah b'tzibur? What about a woman? A woman is obligated to daven. You'll be surprised how many Rabbanim felt that women are like Atchila should try to daven tefillah b'tzibur. Now outside of Yerushalayim, I've almost never seen women during the week come to shul and daven tefillah b'tzibur. So there's so many things that come up. There's another shayla. A lot of people who visit Eretz Yisrael have this on Yom Tov Sheni. If you're Yom Tov Sheni in Eretz Yisrael And so for you, it's Yom Tiv, but for the people, the locals, it's not a Yom Tiv day. Could you, I want to go daven Ma'ariv. Do I have to daven in a Yom Tiv minyan? Or can I daven in a weekday minyan and say that I'm going to daven my Ma'ariv, that they're davening their Ma'ariv? Is that one mitzdarif with the other? Another fascinating shaila. I personally once had the situation. I was I had a bit of a dilemma. I was sitting at Rav Meshua Soloveitchik's his Nilas HaChag. It was for me. It was Erev. It was the night of Simchas Torah, and in Eretz Yisrael it was Matzah Simchas Torah because it was the first day. My Shmini Atzeres was their Simchas Torah, so he was having Nilas HaChag. So I was at the Nilas HaChag, and I was looking at my watch. It's getting later and later. I'm missing my Ma'ariv that I wanted to go daven with the Bnei Chutz La'aretz, but I could have stayed there and daven Ma'ariv with the Bnei Eretz Yisrael. So I excused myself. I said, I'm sorry, I have to go because I promised the person who was trying to put together this Chutz La'aretz minyan that I will be there to finish the minyan. He says, you don't have to excuse yourself. You're obligated to go. So I said, why am I obligated to go? Why can't I just daven Ma'ariv here and daven my Ma'ariv? He says, it's not like Tefillah. You want to try to do things like Tefillah, you shouldn't do that. So that's a question that people deal with, and you can find yourself in situations where you'd want to do that. And that's... interestingly, Shabbos and Yom Tiv, a whole chapter, if there's more of a chiyuv to daven on Shabbos and Yom Tiv b'tzibur. We know the Ramban, it's actually in last week's Parsha, the Ramban says in Parshas Emor that Mikroi Kodesh means gathering in shul on Shabbos and Yom Tiv. So even though during the week, Tefillah b'tzibur is a chiyuv drabanon or even a quasi chiyuv drabanon, but on a Shabbos and Yom Tiv, he says Shabbos. I'm not so sure about Shabbos. Shabbos actually part of Ramban seems to hold that maybe Shabbos not like that, but in the Oyel Shalom at least it says that Shabbos and Yom Tiv might be more of a chiyuv than during the week. A shaila very nogei to Eretz Yisrael about Klei Zayin. You're not allowed to bring Klei Zayin into Beis Medrash. So here you have a soldier. He has weapons, or they have some rednecks in Lakewood who also have guns, and so they're not allowed to bring a gun into a shul if it's exposed. So, and you're not able to hide it. So what do? Do you daven outside the shul or you daven in the shul? These are very relevant, childless, endless. I just want to say one important thing. And I know that, Nachi, you might go and edit out half the things we said, but this thing, it's kedai to leave inside, especially because my grandfather used to say it over. What about a person who wears a gartel all the time and he doesn't have a gartel? So should he daven b'tzibur without a gartel, or should he daven b'tzibur, or should he daven b'tzibur without a gartel, or should he daven rather b'yechidus later on with his gartel? My grandfather used to say, he's a Talmud of the Kloizim Garov, he said in the name of the Kloizim Garov, it says, Lo yama oretz chasid, ve'ein bur yirei chet. He says, how come it says first loy and then ein? Loy ama oretz chasid, ve'ein bur yirei chet. What's that supposed to mean? He said the word loy means a isser. You're not allowed to. Loy, you should not be. He says the Rebbe used to say an ama oretz tarnish zayin ken chasid. Why? Because it's going to come mincha and he won't have a gartel, so he won't have a mincha. So he says loy ama oretz chasid. Also for him to be a chasid. Ve'ein bur yirei chet. It's impossible for this person who's a bur to be a yirei chet. So that's another, again, but he's going a little deeper than that, not just not davening mincha at all, but what about going and missing tefillah b'tzibur because you have to have a gartel? And the questions are, I can't tell you the whole sefer all al regel achas, but it's a fascinating sefer, and it makes also a very pleasant and easy read, and as all mitzvahs and halachas go intertwines with other shilas and other halachas, and it's pleasant and easy. And like I mentioned, you also get the feel of a yeshiva where people are having discussions and talking and learning, and you see, oh, maybe this side, maybe that side. It shows you the development of thought, not just the final psak in dry psak.
Of course, it has a nice sleek cover and nice font from Mechon Al Zayis. We almost forgot to mention that. But yeah, it's a very nice sefer with a lot of really interesting material, and I'll link in the show's notes. Anyone interested can buy it. As always, you can buy it in a Sefarim store. Also, Mechon Al Zayis is available on Al Zayis' website. It comes with free shipping. And so anyone interested can do it that way. And thank you, Rabbi Shimon, for joining me on the podcast once again.
I'm looking forward. Can we meet again next week?
Find me a sefer. That's interesting. And we'll, many things. Mechon has a lot of different Sefarim coming out. I'm waiting for the new Rugged Shaver. We'll tease that already, but there's some other things.
It's on the way.
It's on the way. Redone. Rugged Shaver, Mechon Al Zayis, other Sefarim. So, Mr. Hashem, Bez Hashem, we'll get together again. Thank you.